She was 17 years old, and they were already selling her future. Clara Bennett pressed her back against the barn wall, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the paper. They shoved at her a contract with her name written at the bottom like a price tag on livestock. She didn't cry. She burned it. And the man who watched her do it, a mountain cowboy with hard eyes and a harder past, decided in that moment that some things were worth bleeding for. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel and follow every chapter until the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1884 came to the Montana Territory like a punishment. The heat pressed down on the valley towns, cracking the earth, drying the creek beds, baking the paint off every storefront in Harlow Creek, until the whole place looked like something God had forgotten to finish. Dust swirled in the main street all day long, and by afternoon, even the horses stood still with their heads low, too tired to swat the flies. Ethan Walker hadn't been to Harlow Creek in 4 months. He didn't miss it. He came down from the mountain twice a year, once for supplies, once when the weather forced him. Every time he moved through town fast, kept his hat low, spoke to no one he didn't have business with. People knew who he was, and most of them left him alone. That suited him fine. He was tying his horse outside Garfield's general store when he heard the shouting. Not unusual in Harlow Creek. Men argued about water rights, about cattle, about card debts that had gone too long. Ethan had learned to walk past all of it. Not his trouble, not his business. He'd made that rule 10 years ago, the day he buried his brother on the North Ridge, and understood that the world would chew through good men the same as bad ones, and the only thing a man could do was decide how much of himself he was willing to lose. I was reaching for the door handle when a girl's voice cut through everything else. Not a woman's voice, a girl's. High and raw and terrified the way a sound gets when the person making it has already exhausted all other options. "I won't sign it. You can't make me sign it." Ethan stopped. He stood with his hand on the door and told himself it wasn't his concern. Then came the second voicemail. Older, thick with the particular kind of patience that powerful men use when they've already decided the outcome of a conversation. "Clara, be reasonable. Your father agreed to the terms. The agreement was signed in good faith. What you feel about it doesn't change what's written on that paper. My father didn't have the right to agree to anything on my behalf. I'm not property. You're 17 years old, and you have nowhere to go and nothing to your name. That's not a negotiation, sweetheart. That's a fact." Ethan let go of the door handle. He told himself he was only going to look. He walked around the side of the general store to the narrow alley that ran between it and the feed supply building, and what he saw made something cold settle in his chest. There were 4 of them, all men, all well-dressed in the way that men in Harlow Creek got well-dressed when they wanted to remind you of the distance between themselves and everyone else. In the center of the group, backed against the alley wall, was a girl who couldn't have been more than 17. Her dark hair tangled from what looked like a long journey. Her dress road-worn and patched at both elbows. She was holding a folded piece of paper to her chest, like it was either a weapon or a wound, and her jaw was set so tight Ethan could see the muscle jumping under her skin. She wasn't crying. He noticed that first. The man doing the talking was Gerald Moss. Ethan recognized him, one of the 3 or 4 men in the county who had accumulated enough land and money to believe the rules didn't apply to them. Moss was in his 50s. White-haired, carrying himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been told no and had it stick. "Give me the paper, Clara," Moss said. "We can finish this quietly. No one has to be embarrassed." "I'm not embarrassed," the girl said. "I'm furious. There's a difference." One of the other men laughed, not kindly. "Sign the thing and we'll get you settled before nightfall," he said. "You'll have a roof over your head. Food. That's more than most girls in your position can expect." "My position," Clara said, and her voice had gone very quiet, in the way that voices go quiet before something breaks, "is that I am a human being, and you are trying to purchase my next 5 years, like I'm a mule at auction." Moss sighed the way men sigh when they've decided that patience has run its course. "Take the paper," he said to the man on his left. The man stepped forward. Ethan moved before he'd made a conscious decision to move. He came around the corner into the alley, and he stopped 6 feet from the group, and he said, "I wouldn't." The 4 men turned. Moss looked at him with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during a business transaction. "Walker," he said, "this doesn't concern you." "Maybe not," Ethan said. "But I'd like to hear the lady's position before you make any more decisions on her behalf." "The lady," one of the men said, putting a particular kind of emphasis on the word that made it mean something else entirely, "is a girl with a debt and an agreement she's trying to wriggle out of. This is a private matter." "Don't look very private," Ethan said. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved his hands toward anything. He was just standing there the way he sometimes stood in the mountains when he came across something uncertain, patient, still giving the other party a chance to reconsider. Clara was looking at him. Not with hope exactly. More like someone who has been surprised by something and isn't yet sure whether to trust it. "What's your name?" Ethan asked her directly. "Clara Bennett," she said. "Miss Bennett." He tipped his hat slightly. "Do you want to sign that paper?" "No," she said. "I do not." "Have you been given time to read it through with your own counsel?" "I haven't been given anything," she said. "I was brought here from Billings on a wagon with 2 of Mr. Moss's men and handed that document when we arrived and told to sign it before supper." Ethan looked at Moss. "Is that right?" Moss's expression had shifted from mild irritation to something cooler. "Walker, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'd advise you strongly to walk back around that corner and continue on with whatever errand brought you to town. This is a legal agreement between consenting parties." "She just said she doesn't consent." Her father isn't here," Ethan said. "She is." The silence in the alley was the particular kind that comes right before things go wrong. Ethan had stood in enough of those silences to recognize them. His body had already done its calculations. 4 men, none of them wearing guns on their hips, which meant they were the kind of powerful that didn't need guns in the ordinary way of things because they had other instruments. He wasn't worried about a fight. He was worried about what happened after the fight in the courts and the back offices where men like Moss did their real work. The man who had stepped toward Clara stopped. Moss looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. "We'll finish this conversation tomorrow," he said to her with the particular tone of a man who has simply decided to reschedule a thing rather than abandon it. "When you've had time to think more clearly." He looked at Ethan one more time, not threatening exactly, more assessing, and then he and his 3 men walked out of the alley and back toward the main street. Ethan watched them go. Clara was still pressed against the wall. She was breathing hard, and now that the men were gone and there was no one to be strong in front of her, hands had started to shake against the paper she was holding. "You all right?" Ethan asked. "No," she said. She looked at him with dark eyes that were exhausted and sharp at the same time. "But I'm not going to fall apart if that's what you're wondering." "Wasn't wondering that," he said. "Most people would be," she said. "Most people look at a girl in my situation and expect tears." "Most people haven't spent enough time in the mountains," Ethan said. "Things that don't cry out are often the things you need to watch most carefully." She stared at him. "That's an unusual thing to say." "Probably," he agreed. He looked at the paper in her hands. "What does it say?" She hesitated. Then she unfolded it and held it out to him, and he stepped forward and took it and read it in the alley's thin shade. It was a labor contract. 5 years of domestic service to Gerald Moss's household in exchange for the settlement of a debt her father had apparently incurred the previous winter, $800 borrowed against a cattle operation that had since failed. The contract transferred her father's obligation to Clara, directly framing her service as voluntary repayment. It was written carefully enough that anyone reading it quickly would see a business arrangement. Anyone reading it slowly would see something else. Ethan folded it and handed it back. "How much do you know about the law?" he asked. "Enough to know this isn't legal," she said. "Debt can't transfer between individuals without consent. And even if it could, this contract would effectively make me an indentured servant, which hasn't been legal in this country since before either of us was born." He looked at her with something that was almost surprise. "Where'd you learn that?" "My mother taught school for 12 years before she died," Clara said. "I've read more books than most men in this county, Mr. She paused. "I don't know your name." "Ethan Walker." "Mr. Walker." She folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress. "Thank you for what you did, but you should understand Moss isn't going to let this go. He's been trying to get my father's land for 2 years. Taking me was his way of pressuring my father to sign over the deed. If he can't use me, he'll find another way." "Where's your father now?" Something passed across her face. "Dead," she said. 3 weeks ago. Moss doesn't know yet. Or maybe he does, and that's why he's moving faster now." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Where are you planning to go?" he asked. She lifted her chin. "I haven't decided yet," which meant nowhere. Which meant she was standing in an alley in a town where the most powerful man had just publicly declared an intention to hold her to a contract she hadn't signed, and she had no money, no family, no plan, and a face that was doing everything it could not to show any of that. "I've got a ranch," Ethan said, "up on the North Ridge. It's not much, but it's far enough from town that Moss's men don't make the ride often." Clara looked at him steadily. "Why would you offer that?" "Because you're in trouble, and I've got a place." "That's not an answer, she said. "That's a description. Why would you take that risk? You don't know me." "No," Ethan admitted. "I don't." "Then why?" "I thought about it." He thought about saying something simpler, something about Christian duty, or common decency, or the general principle that a man didn't walk away from a young woman backed against a wall by 4 grown men with papers. All of those things were true, but they weren't the real answer. The real answer was that he'd heard her say, "I'm not property," in a voice that didn't waver, and something in him had recognized that voice, and he couldn't entirely explain why, except that he knew the sound of a person trying very hard to hold on to who they were in a world that was actively trying to convince them they were worth less than they believed. He knew that sound because he'd made it himself in a different alley in a different town a long time ago. "Let's just say I've met Gerald Moss before," Ethan said, "and I know what his patience looks like right before it runs out." Clara studied him for a long moment. She was measuring him. He could see it, the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to take help at face value, because help could be another kind of trap. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "I'm not signing anything. I'm not agreeing to anything. I'm not beholden to you for the shelter." "Fine," Ethan said, "and I'll work for my keep. I'm not a charity case." "Didn't say you were." "And if you turn out to be anything like Gerald Moss?" "I'm not." "I have no way of knowing that yet." "No," he said. "You don't. You'll have to decide what to trust." Another long silence. Then Clara Bennett straightened up from the wall, settled her worn dress with the dignity of someone putting on armor, and looked at Ethan Walker with those dark, exhausted eyes. "All right," she said. "Show me your horse." Takang. The North Ridge was 2 hours above Harlow Creek by trail, and it got quieter with every 100 feet of elevation. Clara didn't talk much on the ride up. She sat behind Ethan on the big gray gelding, keeping a careful few inches of space between them, one hand light on his shoulder for balance. The summer heat eased as they climbed, replaced by the dry cool that lived in the pine stands along the upper slopes, and Clara breathed it in like someone who had been waiting for air. Ethan pointed out the landmarks as they passed them, not because she needed to know them yet, but because silence between 2 strangers on a long trail could go wrong if you let it sit too heavy. "That creek bed on the left dries out by August," he said. "There's a spring a 1/4 mile east that runs year-round. That's the one to remember." "How long have you been up here?" she asked. "On this property 6 years. In these mountains most of my life." "You don't have family." "Not anymore." She didn't push that. He appreciated it. "The town calls you the ghost cowboy," she said instead, and her voice had just enough wry edge to it that he almost smiled. "I know what they call me." "Does it bother you?" "Did once," he said. "Not particularly anymore." "What changed?" He considered that. "Got tired of caring what people in Harlow Creek thought about anything," he said. They're mostly wrong about most things. They're mostly wrong about me, Clara said. According to them, I'm trouble. I noticed. Do you think they're right? You burned a legal document in a public alley, Ethan said. Whether that's trouble or principle probably depends on which side of the thing you're standing on. This time she did laugh, a short, surprised sound like she hadn't expected to and wasn't entirely sure she should have. The document wasn't valid, she said. I know. I checked. I spent 2 days in the Billings courthouse before Moss's men found me looking at precedent. Debt assignment without formal court order isn't enforceable in Montana territory. A judge would throw that contract out in 10 minutes. Then why not go to a judge? The laugh faded. Because Moss owns the judge, she said quietly. And the sheriff, and the bank, and the paper that prints the news. She paused. And because I'm 17, and my father is dead, and I have no legal advocate, and the 2 lawyers in Billings that I approached both told me they'd rather not take Gerald Moss as an adversary. Ethan was quiet for a moment. So you're not just in trouble, he said. No, she agreed. I'm comprehensively in trouble. The ranch appeared as they came around the last bend on the ridge. A main cabin, a barn, a chicken, run 3 paddocks visible through the pines, and beyond it all, the mountain valley spreading out to the south in the last of the afternoon light. It wasn't grand. It was solid. That was different. Clara slid down from the horse before Ethan could dismount to help her, landed on her feet, and looked at the place with the careful attention of someone cataloging resources. How many horses? She asked. 4, including this one. Chickens? 11. Used to be 14. What happened to the other 3? Winter was hard. She nodded, still looking around. Garden. Back of the cabin. Not much. I'm not a careful farmer. She turned and looked at him as he dismounted. You live here alone? Yes. For 6 years? Yes. That's a lot of work for one person. It is, he said. She looked at the cabin again. He watched her measuring things: the woodpile, the water barrel, the condition of the fence rails. She was doing the same kind of calculation he did whenever he arrived somewhere new. What works, what doesn't, what needs attention, how sustainable is this? All right, she said finally. I can help with the garden, and I can take over the chickens. I know chickens. You grew up on a farm. My father's place, she said. We had 40 acres in the Yellowstone Valley, before the drought, before the debt. Her voice stayed level, but he heard what was underneath it, the particular flatness of someone describing a loss they haven't finished processing yet. I know how to work. I believe you, Ethan said. She looked at him then directly for a long moment. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who wanted something from helping me. Most people do, he said. He thought about it honestly. I want to sleep without thinking about that alley, he said. If that counts. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, she didn't strike him as someone who moved to softness quickly. But something in the careful assessment eased slightly. That counts, she said. The cabin had one main room and a sleeping loft, and Ethan spent the first hour after their arrival moving things around so that the loft was Clara's, with a blanket hung across the ladder opening for privacy. He took his bedroll to the main room floor without comment. Clara stood at the top of the ladder and looked down at him. You don't have to do that, she said. I can sleep in the barn. You're not sleeping in the barn, Ethan said. I've slept in worse. I know. That doesn't mean you should have to. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said, and the words came out slightly rough, like she hadn't said them in a while, and had forgotten how they felt. There's salt pork and cornbread from 2 days ago, he said. Nothing fresh until tomorrow, and there's a basin on the back wall if you want to wash the road off. I'll manage, she said. She disappeared behind the blanket. Ethan sat down at the table in the main room and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling into a different shape. 2 people moving through it instead of one. The small adjustments and careful courtesies of strangers trying not to intrude on each other. He hadn't heard those sounds in a long time. He wasn't sure yet whether that was good or not. 3 days passed. They were careful days, both of them orbiting the ranch without quite overlapping. Ethan handled the horses and the fence lines and the firewood. Clara took the garden and the chickens, and on the second day, quietly made a proper inventory of the cellar and rearranged it in a way that made everything easier to find. She didn't ask permission to do it. She just did it. And when Ethan saw the difference, he didn't comment because they had established without quite discussing it that she wasn't a guest here and didn't need to ask. On the evening of the third day, she found him at the paddock fence, watching the horses in the late light. "Someone came up the trail today," she said, "while you were checking the east fence." He turned to look at her. "Who?" "I don't know. I didn't go out. I watched from the window. One rider, good horse, not a working horse. He circled the barn and then left." "What direction?" "South, back toward town." Ethan turned back to the horses. "One of Moss's men, probably," he said. "Probably," she agreed. She stood beside him at the fence. "He's not going to stop." "No." "What happens when he sends more than one rider?" "Then we'll deal with more than one rider," Ethan said. "That's not a plan," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "It's a fact. The plan comes after." She looked at him with an expression that was halfway between exasperation and something that might eventually become trust. "Do you always think this way?" she said. "What way?" "Like you're already past the thing. Like you've already decided you'll get through it, and you're just waiting for the situation to catch up." He thought about that. "I suppose," he said. "I've been through enough situations that panicking before they arrive hasn't ever helped." "What has helped?" "Knowing the land," he said. "Knowing who you can trust. Knowing what you're willing to stand for before someone asks you to stand." Clara was quiet for the moment. The light was going gold over the mountain's shoulder, and the horses moved slowly through it, and the evening smelled like pine and dry grass and the far-off suggestion of rain. "What are you willing to stand for?" she asked. "When it comes to this?" He looked at her. "That contract was wrong," he said. "What Moss is doing is wrong. The fact that he has the resources to keep doing it doesn't make it less wrong." He paused. "I spent a long time telling myself that other people's wrong wasn't my problem. I'm not sure I believe that anymore." She nodded slowly. "My mother used to say," she said, "a town that stays quiet about its injustices becomes an accomplice to them." "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Clara said. "She also died young and broke and worn out, so I've had complicated feelings about her wisdom ever since." It was the most she'd said about herself in 3 days, and Ethan understood that it had cost something to say it. He didn't push further. "You should know," Clara said, after a moment, her voice matter-of-fact, "that I've been thinking about what options I have. And there's a federal land office in Helena," she said. "If Moss's claim on my father's land involved fraud, and I believe it did, there may be grounds for a federal complaint. The trick is getting there and getting someone to listen." She glanced at him. "Also, I found a copy of the original debt agreement in my father's papers. The interest rates Moss charged were usurious, possibly illegally so." Ethan turned to look at her fully. "You had your father's papers with you?" "In my travel bag, sewn into the lining." She met his eyes steadily. "I wasn't sure what would happen when Moss's men picked me up. I wanted to make sure the important things came with me." He stared at her. She had ridden into Harlow Creek, cornered by 4 men, facing a coerced contract and no allies, with the evidence that could potentially undo the whole situation hidden in the lining of her bag. "You're not what I expected either," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "What did you expect?" she said. "Someone who needed saving," he said. "Everyone needs saving sometimes," Clara said. "The question is what they do with it after." She looked back at the horses. "I need time, Mr. Walker, and I need to not be handed over to Gerald Moss while I figure out my next step. That's what I actually need." "Then that's what you'll have," Ethan said. The evening deepened around them. Below, somewhere down the mountain, Harlow Creek went about its business in the last of the summer light, and Gerald Moss sat in his comfortable house, making plans that he believed were already finished. He didn't know about the papers sewn into Clara Bennett's bag. He didn't know about Ethan Walker's particular and specific relationship with the idea of giving up. And he didn't know not yet that sometimes the two most dangerous things in the world are a woman with nothing left to lose and a man who has finally decided what he's willing to fight for. But he would. The rider came back on the fourth morning, not alone this time. Ethan heard them before he saw them. 3 horses on the South Trail, moving at a pace that said they weren't making a social call. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when the sound reached him, and he set the axe down against the block and walked around to the front without hurrying, because hurrying told people things about your state of mind that you sometimes couldn't afford to tell them. Clara was already at the window. 3, she said quietly when he stepped inside. I counted. One of them is the same man from yesterday. The other 2 I don't recognize. She paused. They're armed. Most men out here are armed, Ethan said. These ones are armed the way men are armed when they've been told to make a point, Clara said. He looked at her. She was right, and she knew it, and she wasn't frightened. Or if she was, she'd already made her peace with it and moved on to practical thinking. He found that steadying in a way he hadn't anticipated. Stay inside, he said. Ethan, not because you can't handle yourself, he said. Because 3 men on horses looking for leverage don't need to see you standing in the yard. She considered that for exactly 1 second. Then she stepped back from the window, but didn't go far. He could feel her positioned just to the left of the doorframe, out of sight, but close enough to hear everything. He walked out onto the porch. The 3 riders pulled up about 20 feet from the steps. The one in the middle was the kind of big that came from years of physical work, broad across the shoulders, thick-necked with the particular blankness in his face of a man who has been paid to deliver a message and has no personal investment in how it's received. The 2 on either side were younger, watchful. Walker, the big man said. That's right, Ethan said. Name's Doyle. I work for Mr. Moss. I figured. Doyle shifted in his saddle. Mr. Moss wants to talk to you. Friendly conversation. He's asking you to come down to town today. He can come up the mountain if he wants to talk, Ethan said. I don't make trips to town on short notice. He thought you might say that. Doyle reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He asked me to give you this. One of the younger men nudged his horse forward a step and leaned down to hold the envelope out. Ethan walked down the porch steps, took it, walked back up, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a careful, deliberate hand. Mr. Walker, I have no quarrel with you. The girl staying at your property has obligations she is attempting to avoid. I am prepared to be generous in resolving this matter, but I need to speak with her directly. Bring her to my office in Harlow Creek by Friday, and I will ensure that no difficulty comes to you or your property as a result of your involvement. Fail to do so, and I will need to pursue other avenues. G. Moss. Ethan read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Tell Mr. Moss thank you for the letter, he said. Doyle waited. And tell him Miss Bennett isn't available Friday, Ethan said. Or any other day he has in mind. Something moved in Doyle's expression. Not surprise. More like a man confirming what he already expected. Mr. Moss won't like that, Doyle said. I imagine not, Ethan agreed. He's a patient man, Doyle said, but he's not an infinitely patient man. You understand what I'm saying? I understand perfectly, Ethan said. I'll send you back with the same message. Miss Bennett is not available. If Mr. Moss has a legal grievance he'd like to pursue, there are courts for that. If he'd like to pursue other avenues instead, he should think carefully about what that looks like for him. A long silence. Then Doyle gathered his reins. Friday, he said. One word. And the 3 of them turned their horses and went back down the South Trail. Ethan stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then he went back inside. Clara was exactly where he'd expected, just inside the door, having heard every word. He'll come back, she said. Yes. With more than 3. Probably. She looked at him steadily. You didn't have to do that. You could have told him I wasn't here. You could have told him I left. He wouldn't have believed it, Ethan said. And it would have given him reason to keep testing. This way he knows where things stand. Where things stand, Clara said slowly, is that you just made an enemy of the most powerful man in this county on behalf of a girl you've known 4 days. Seems like it, Ethan said. Why? The word was quiet, not challenging, genuinely asking, like she needed to understand the mechanism of it because she'd been in enough situations where people's motives turned out to be something other than what they presented. Ethan thought about giving her the practical answer that Moss would have found a way to cause him trouble. Eventually, anyway, that men like Moss always did, that it was better to be clear from the start. All of that was true. Because what that letter said was a threat, he said instead. And I don't negotiate with threats. Not anymore. Not anymore, she repeated. He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. But something in the air between them shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of things falling into place, but quietly, the way light changes when a cloud moves. That afternoon, Clara spread her father's papers across the kitchen table. Ethan sat across from her, and she walked him through them, not because she needed his permission to pursue anything, but because she'd been thinking for 4 days, and she needed someone to think with, and Ethan Walker had proven himself so far to be a man who listened when a woman talked without waiting for her to finish so he could correct her. The original loan was $300, she said, smoothing out a yellowed document. Taken out in January of last year. My father needed it to get through the winter, lost half his cattle to the freeze, and couldn't pay his hands. Moss lent it at what the paper calls standard interest. What did that turn out to mean? 22% compounded monthly. Ethan looked at her. In 8 months. Clara said. $300 became $800. By the time my father died, Moss was claiming the debt had grown to $1,100. She tapped the document. The maximum legal interest rate in Montana Territory is 12% annually, not monthly, annually. So the contract was built on an illegal debt, Ethan said. The contract was built on a fraudulent calculation of an illegal debt, yes. She set the document down and picked up a second one, older, more worn. And this is the deed to my father's land. 42 acres in the Yellowstone Valley. My father never signed it over to Moss. But Moss's men told me when they came to collect me that the property had already been transferred. She looked at Ethan directly. Someone forged my father's signature. The words landed in the quiet of the cabin. You have proof of that? Ethan asked. I have my father's genuine signature on 6 other documents, including 2 from the same month the transfer was supposedly made. His hand was distinctive. He broke 2 fingers on his right hand in 1871. And it affected his writing for the rest of his life. Any competent examiner could tell the difference in 10 minutes. You've been planning this, Ethan said. I've been surviving this, Clara corrected. There's a difference. Planning implies I had options. She looked down at the papers. I've been surviving it and documenting it, and waiting for a moment when I might actually be somewhere safe enough to take the next step. Helena, Ethan said. The Federal Land Office. Yes. If I can get there with these papers and speak to someone above the county level. Someone Moss doesn't own, there's a real case here. Not just for my father's land. Moss has been doing versions of this to people in this valley for years. I've spoken to 3 other families who lost land to him under similar circumstances. She paused. I have statements from 2 of them, signed and witnessed. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. How long have you been collecting this? He said. Since February, she said. 4 months, after my father got sick, and I understood that Moss was going to move the moment he was gone. She straightened the papers and began carefully stacking them. I know I'm asking more of you than you agreed to. Keeping me here was already a risk. What I'm asking now is different. What are you asking? I need to get to Helena, she said. And I need to get there before Moss figures out what I have. If he finds out about these papers... She stopped. He'll stop being patient, Ethan said. He'll stop being patient, she agreed. He looked at her across the table. This girl who was 17 years old and had spent 4 months quietly building a federal case against the most powerful land grabber in the county while nursing her dying father and pretending to be nothing more than a helpless girl with a debt problem. "You're remarkable," he said. It came out plain, not as a compliment exactly, more as an assessment. A fact he'd arrived at. Clara looked at him sharply, like she was bracing for something to follow that undermined it. When nothing followed, she looked back down at her papers. "My mother was remarkable," she said. "I'm just stubborn." They left for Helena 2 days later before dawn. Ethan didn't tell anyone in Harlow Creek they were going. He packed light enough for a 5-day ride, bedrolls, food, his rifle across his saddle, the spare pistol he put in his saddlebag without comment. Clara had sewn her father's documents back into the lining of her bag, and she carried it herself at all times, and he didn't suggest otherwise. The mountain trail north bypassed Harlow Creek entirely. It was harder going longer by half a day, but it kept them out of Moss's sight, and distance right now was worth more than time. They didn't talk much in the early morning dark. The horses moved steady and careful on the trail, and the mountains rose around them in the pre-dawn quiet. And Ethan was aware, in the particular way he'd become aware of things since she'd arrived, that Clara was not the kind of person who filled silence to avoid it. She sat in it the same way she sat in difficulty, with a straight back and her eyes forward. Around mid-morning she said, "Tell me about the brother." He didn't answer immediately. "You mentioned you don't have family anymore," she said. Not as a question, like a door you'd closed. "But you said not anymore, which means there was a time when you did." He watched the trail ahead. "My brother's name was Daniel," he said. "He was 2 years younger than me. We had a ranch together before this one, down in the valley near Crow Creek. Good land, decent water, we'd worked it for 8 years. "What happened?" "A man named Aldrich," Ethan said. "Same type as Moss. Same method, came in patient, offered loans when we had a bad season. Wrote the terms in language that sounded reasonable until you read it 3 times. By the time we understood what we'd agreed to, the interest had buried us." Clara was quiet, listening. "Daniel wanted to fight it," Ethan said. "He went to the sheriff. The sheriff told him it was a civil matter. He went to the county judge. The judge told him the contract was valid. He went to the newspaper." He paused. "The newspaper ran a story about how 2 young ranchers were trying to avoid a legal debt." "What did you do?" Clara asked. "I told him to let it go," Ethan said. "I told him we'd start over somewhere else, that the land wasn't worth what it would cost to fight." He said it without inflection, the way people say things they've said to themselves 10,000 times. Daniel didn't agree. He kept fighting. He kept fighting, alone, for 8 months. And then one winter night, he was riding back from a meeting with a lawyer in Billings, and his horse came home without him. Ethan kept his eyes on the trail. "They said it was an accident. Horse spooked on the ice." The silence stretched. "You didn't believe that," Clara said. "I had no proof of anything else," he said. "And I was 29 years old, and I'd just watched my brother spend 8 months fighting the right fight the right way and end up dead on a frozen road. So I took what I could carry and came up here, and I decided that the best thing I could do was not care about anything that Aldrich or Moss or anyone like them might want." "Until 4 days ago," Clara said. He glanced at her. "Until 4 days ago," he said. She didn't say anything for a while. The trail wound through a high pine stand, dropping into shadow, and then back into morning light. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said finally, simply, without embellishment. "Thank you," Ethan said, which was also simple, and enough. They made camp that night on a flat shelf of rock above a narrow creek, and Ethan built a small fire, and Clara made coffee in the tin pot from his saddlebag, and they sat with the cups warming their hands and the dark mountain around them and the fire between them. "I want you to understand something," Clara said. He waited. "If something goes wrong in Helena, if Moss has connections there, or if the federal office won't see us, or if something happens to the papers, I don't want you to feel responsible." She looked at the fire. "You didn't ask for this. You helped a stranger in an alley and somehow ended up riding to the Capitol with forged deeds and a 17-year-old girl who has made enemies of half the county. That's not what you signed up for." "What did I sign up for?" Ethan said. "A quiet life on a mountain," she said. He considered that. "The quiet life," he said, "was never as quiet as it looked, and I've been carrying Daniel around on that mountain for 10 years. Maybe it's time I did something with what I know about men like Moss, rather than just knowing it. Clara looked at him, then full on the firelight on her face, and something in her expression had gone complicated in a way that was hard to name. Not soft, not grateful exactly. Something more guarded than either of those, but pointed in the same direction. "You're a strange man, Ethan Walker," she said. "I've heard that. I don't mean it badly." "I know," he said. They were a half-day from Helena when the trouble found them. It came in the form of two riders on the north trail ahead, not moving toward them, just stopped blocking the path, the way men block paths when they've been told to wait and confirm before acting. One of them Ethan recognized from Harlow Creek. He didn't know the other. He reined the gray to a halt, beside him. Clara pulled up her horse. Ethan's spare mare, and said nothing, but her hand moved to the saddlebag where she kept the documents, checking by reflex that it was still there and latched. "Walker," the familiar one called out. "Long way from home." "So are you," Ethan said. "Mr. Moss asked us to find you." The man had the easy posture of someone who isn't worried about the outcome of the conversation. "Wanted to know why you were headed north." "I go where I need to go," Ethan said. "With the Bennett girl," the man said. "That's the part Mr. Moss is interested in." His eyes moved to Clara, and something in the look made Ethan's jaw tighten. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Moss was concerned for your welfare." "I'm sure he was," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly level. "He'd like you to come back with us. We'll take you safely to Harlow Creek. You can talk to Mr. Moss directly. And this whole misunderstanding—" "It isn't a misunderstanding," Clara said. The man stopped. "I understand exactly what Mr. Moss wants," she said. "And the answer is no. I am traveling to Helena on legal business that is no concern of yours or his. You can ride back and tell him that." The two men exchanged a look. "Miss, we're not really asking," the second one said, and his tone was different, flat, final, the tone of men who have moved past the conversation portion of an encounter. Ethan moved his horse one step to the left, putting himself between Clara and the two riders. "She gave you her answer," he said. "Walker, she gave you her answer," he said again. "And I'll give you mine. You're two men on a trail, and I'm a man who has ridden these mountains alone for 6 years, which means I know every pass and cutoff within 20 miles of where we're standing. Miss Bennett and I can be off this trail in 4 directions before you've made up your minds which one to follow. And one of those directions goes straight to the Helena Federal Office." He let that land. "So you can move aside, or you can follow us. And either way, we'll arrive where we're going. But if you follow us, you'll be riding into a federal building behind a woman carrying documents that name Gerald Moss in a fraud complaint, which is the kind of entrance that tends to draw attention." The two men went still. He'd gambled on the fact that they were Moss's hired riders, not his hired thinkers. Men told to intercept and redirect, not men trusted with the whole picture of what was at stake. The gamble held. The familiar one looked at the second rider. Something passed between them. Then they pulled their horses off the trail. "Your funeral," the familiar one said. But he said it to the air, not to either of them in particular, and when Ethan nudged the gray forward, they didn't follow. He and Clara rode past them without looking back and kept a steady pace for the next quarter mile before either of them said anything. "You bluffed," Clara said. "Partially," Ethan said. "Which part was the bluff?" "The part about knowing every pass and cutoff," he said. "I know most of them, not all." Clara looked at him, and then she laughed. Not the short, surprised sound from before, but a full one, real and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has just come through something frightening and found themselves intact on the other side. It was the best Ethan Walker had heard in longer than he could remember, and the fact that it hit him that way was something he filed away carefully in the part of himself he was still trying to understand. Helena rose into view in the late afternoon of the 5th day, and Clara sat up straighter on her horse at the sight of it, not with relief, but with the particular sharpening of attention that comes before you walk into the most important room you've ever entered. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm going in anyway." "That's the only kind of ready that matters," he said. She glanced at him with something quick and unreadable. Then she reached up and pressed her hand briefly against the saddlebag that held her father's papers, a gesture so private he almost looked away. "I need you to know something," she said. She kept her eyes forward on the city below. "Whatever happens in that office, whatever they say, whatever Moss has done to prepare for this, I don't regret coming. I don't regret any of this." Ethan kept his eyes on the trail. "Neither do I," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in 10 years, and it scared him slightly. And he said it anyway, because Clara Bennett was not a woman you lied to, even by omission. And he'd stopped being the man who did that the moment he heard her say, "I'm not property in an alley," and recognized the voice. They rode down into Helena as the sun was going west, and the federal land office was still open. And Clara Bennett walked through those doors with her father's papers in her hands, and her spine straight, and her chin level. And Ethan Walker stood just behind her left shoulder and let her lead. Because this was hers. He was just making sure no one tried to take it from her. And in the waiting room, while the clerk went to find the supervisor, and Clara sat at the edge of her chair with her hands folded and her face composed, a man stepped out of the inner office door and looked at the two of them, and his eyes moved from Clara to Ethan, and then back to Clara. And then he said, "Miss Bennett." Clara stood. "Yes," she said. "I received a telegraph from Harlow Creek this morning," the man said. "From a Mr. Moss. He told me to expect you." The room went very quiet. Clara's hands didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But Ethan saw the slight shift of weight in her feet, the adjustment of someone who has just received bad news and is deciding what to do with it in real time. "I expect he did," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "I also expect the telegraph arrived before we did, which means Mr. Moss knew our destination ahead of time, which means someone on the North Trail told him." She looked at the man directly. "I'd like to know before we go any further whether you work for the federal government of the United States or for Gerald Moss. Because I have documents here that are relevant to that question, and I intend to give them to whichever one of those things you actually are." The man stared at her. Then slowly he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, Miss Bennett," he said. And his voice, Ethan thought, had the sound of a man who hadn't expected that particular quality of directness, and was adjusting his understanding of the situation accordingly. "Let's hear what you have." Clara walked through the door. Ethan followed. And behind them, somewhere down the South Trail, and 2 days hard riding away, Gerald Moss sat in his comfortable house and believed he had won, because he always won, because winning was simply a matter of patience and resources, and the understanding that most people eventually could be made to fold. He had never in all his years of patient winning met Clara Bennett before. That was about to matter very much. The Federal Land Office supervisor's name was Arthur Greer, and within the first 5 minutes of the meeting, Ethan understood 3 things about him. First, he was not Gerald Moss's man. The telegraph from Harlow Creek had clearly rattled him, but it hadn't directed him. There was a difference between a man who received a warning and a man who received an order, and Greer had the posture of the former. Cautious. Watching. Not yet decided. Second, he was the kind of bureaucrat who believed deeply in process, which meant Clara's documents needed to be not just compelling, but airtight, because a man like Greer would look for any procedural reason to redirect a difficult situation rather than walk into the middle of it. Third, he had not expected Clara Bennett to be 17 years old. That last one. Ethan watched play out across Greer's face in real time. The slight recalibration, the reassessment. The moment where the supervisor of a federal land office realized he was sitting across a desk from a girl young enough to be his daughter, who had just laid out a fraud case with the methodical precision of a trained attorney. Clara gave him no time to condescend. She placed the documents on the desk in the order she'd planned the original loan agreement first. Then, the interest calculation, with the legal rate comparison, written in her own hand on a separate sheet. Then the property deed with the forged signature. Then the genuine signature samples from 6 other documents. Then the 2 sworn statements from neighboring families. The loan was made at 22% compounded monthly, she said. The territorial legal ceiling is 12% annually. Every dollar of debt beyond the original principal is therefore uncollectible under law. The contract Mr. Moss presented me with was built on that fraudulent debt. It is void. Greer looked at the documents. The property deed, Clara continued tapping it, was transferred without my father's genuine consent. He was ill. I can provide medical testimony to that effect, and the signature does not match any authentic example from within a 3-year window. This was not a clerical error. The formation of the letters is structurally different in a way consistent with forgery, not degradation from illness. Miss Bennett, Greer said carefully, these are serious allegations. Yes, she said. They are. That's why I'm here, rather than in a county courthouse that Mr. Moss has had 30 years to cultivate. Greer looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. This was Clara's ground. The two statements, Clara said, are from Thomas Carey of Widow Creek and Ruth Pollard of the Elk Basin Settlement. Both lost land to Mr. Moss under arrangements structurally identical to my father's loans at illegal rates, followed by transfer agreements signed under duress, or in Mrs. Pollard's case, signed by someone other than herself entirely. Greer picked up Ruth Pollard's statement and read it slowly. His expression changed as he read, not dramatically, but in the way of a man who has just understood that what he thought was a local dispute is something considerably larger. How many families, he said. That I've spoken to directly 6, Clara said. That I believe exist based on the land transfer records at the Harlow Creek Courthouse, which are public record closer to 20. Silence. Greer set the statement down. Mr. Moss's telegraph this morning, he said, described you as a young woman attempting to avoid a legitimate debt obligation through false claims against a respected county landowner. I imagine it did, Clara said. What does the telegram you received from him say about my father's land? Greer paused. It doesn't mention it. No, Clara said. It wouldn't. Another silence. Longer. I'll need to keep these documents, Greer said, for examination. Clara reached into her bag and produced a second set copies, written in her careful hand on fresh paper. These are copies. The originals stay with me until I have a receipt and a case number. She set the copies on the desk. I've been alone with these papers for 4 months, Mr. Greer. I'd like a federal signature before I release them. Greer looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his pen. They were in that office for 2 hours. When they came out, Clara had a case number, a signed receipt, and an appointment for the following morning when Greer's senior examiner would review the forgery evidence. She walked to the hitching post, where their horses waited, and stood with her hand on the mare's neck and didn't say anything for a full minute. Ethan waited. He believed me, she said finally. He believed the documents, Ethan said. Same thing, she said. The documents are mine. I built them. She turned to look at him, and there was something raw in her face that she wasn't entirely hiding. The particular openness of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that the moment the weight shifts even slightly, the body doesn't quite know what to do with the change. 4 months. I spent 4 months being careful and quiet and not letting anyone see what I was building, because I knew the moment Moss found out it would be over. And I walked in there today and laid it all on a desk and... She stopped. And it held, Ethan said. It held, she said. He didn't tell her she'd been remarkable, even though she had been. She didn't need his assessment right now. She needed a minute to just be a 17-year-old girl who had done an enormous thing and was allowed to feel the size of it. So he stood beside her at the hitching post and let the minute pass, and then he said, There's a boarding house 2 streets over. We should eat something and sleep before tomorrow. Clara nodded. She pressed her forehead briefly against the mare's neck, a small private gesture, the kind you make when you need something solid under your hands. Then she straightened. All right, she said. The telegram arrived at Greer's office at 7 the following morning, before either of them had been shown back in. Ethan found out about it because he was already in the corridor when the clerk came in from the telegraph office with the paper, and he read the look on the clerk's face, the suppressed urgency, the careful neutrality, and followed him far enough to hear the name Moss spoken twice through the office door before it closed. I went back to the boarding house and found Clara eating breakfast with her bag on the chair beside her because Clara Bennett did not let the documents out of arm's reach. There's a new telegram, he said. She put down her fork. He told her what he'd seen. She listened with her eyes steady and her hands flat on the table. "He's escalating," she said. "He's had overnight to think, and he's talking to whoever he has in Helena, and now he's pressuring Greer directly." "Can Greer be pressured?" "Everyone can be pressured," Clara said. "The question is whether Greer is the kind of man who pressures easily or the kind who pressures badly." She picked her fork back up. "We go in at 9 as scheduled. If Greer has turned, we'll see it immediately. If he hasn't, we proceed. And if he has—" She chewed, swallowed, looked at him. "Then I ask him to his face whether he's willing to put his signature on a document that buries a fraud case involving 20 families," she said. "And I let him decide what kind of man he is." Ethan drank his coffee. "You've thought about this a long time," he said. "I've thought about everything a long time," she said. "I had 4 months and very little else to do." He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. Greer had not turned. But something in his office had changed overnight, and Ethan felt it the moment they walked in. A new tension, the air of a place that had received unwelcome attention from above. Greer was stiffer than the previous afternoon. His senior examiner, a thin man named Calloway, who had the careful demeanor of someone who spent his days looking at handwriting and numbers, was already at the desk with the copied documents spread before him. "The examiner has had a chance to review," Greer said. "Mr. Calloway." Calloway looked up. "The signature discrepancy is real," he said with the flat certainty of a man who has held 2 documents side by side and reached a conclusion. "The formation of the capital B in Bennett and the angle of the terminal strokes in the surname are inconsistent with the authenticated samples. This is not age or illness." He paused. "Someone else wrote this." Clara let out a breath so small Ethan almost didn't hear it. "I'd like to note," Greer said with the careful tone of a man navigating something he didn't choose, "that I received correspondence this morning suggesting this matter is being handled at the county level, and that federal involvement may be—" He stopped. Tried again. "The correspondence suggested there may be context I'm not yet aware of." "Mr. Greer," Clara said. "Miss Bennett. Is the signature forged or isn't it?" Greer looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at Greer. "The evidence strongly suggests it is," Calloway said. "Then there is no context," Clara said, "that makes a forged property deed something other than what it is. I understand that Mr. Moss has connections in this city, and I understand that those connections are making your morning more difficult than you expected. But you have a federal examiner sitting in front of you who has just told you a man forged a dead farmer's signature to steal his land. That is what is on your desk right now. Everything else is noise." The room held. Greer looked at Clara for a long time. "I'll open a formal investigation," he said. They left Helena at noon. The ride south was different from the ride north, quieter in a different key. Not the quiet of 2 people managing uncertainty, but the quiet of 2 people who had done a difficult thing and were now living in the space afterward, where you have to figure out what shape you are when the crisis isn't actively holding you together. Ethan felt it somewhere around the 2nd hour, when the city had dropped fully behind them and the mountain trail opened up ahead. The awareness of Clara, not abstract, not as a problem to be solved or a person to protect, but as a specific, particular presence, riding to his left, her profile steady in the afternoon light. He'd been alone a long time. He knew what alone felt like. He knew the exact texture of it, the specific weight of a cabin with 1 person in it, the way a fire only had one side, the way decisions about the next day were made entirely in one head. That texture had changed in the past week. He wasn't sure what to do with the change, so he did what he generally did with things he wasn't sure about. He left it alone and let it be what it was and watched the trail. "Are you worried about going back?" Clara asked around the 3rd hour. "About what Moss does next, you mean?" "Yes." He thought about it honestly. "Some," he said. "He knows the case is open. He knows we went to Helena. He won't know yet exactly what we gave them, but he'll know it was enough to open a formal file, and that changes things for him." "Makes him more dangerous," Clara said. "Makes him more urgent," Ethan said. "Which isn't the same thing exactly. Urgent men make mistakes that patient men don't." He could try to make the documents disappear, she said. The originals. He could try. He'll come for the ranch. Ethan looked at her. Probably, he said. You knew that when we rode back, she said. It wasn't an accusation, more like a confirmation she needed to hear. Yes, he said. Why didn't you say so? Because you'd just done the bravest thing I've ever watched anyone do, he said, and you didn't need a new problem to carry for the next 2 days. The ranch will still be there when we get to it. Clara was quiet for a moment. I'm not fragile, she said. I know that, he said. That's not why I didn't say it. Then why? He thought about how to say it honestly. Because you've been carrying everything alone for 4 months, he said. And sometimes the kindest thing you can give a person isn't information. It's 2 days where they don't have to. Another silence. Longer. That's the strangest form of kindness I've ever had offered to me, Clara said. Stranger than a mountain cowboy hiding you from a land contract, Ethan said. The corner of her mouth moved. Fair point, she said. They were 4 hours from the ranch when they smelled the smoke. Not cookfire smoke. Not the clean, resinous burn of pines. The heavy, specific smell of something structural. Something built. Ethan reined up. Clara pulled up beside him and lifted her face into the air, the way you do when you're trying to read something with your whole body. That's coming from the ridge, she said. He was already moving. He pushed the gray hard up the last switchback of the trail and came around the final bend and saw it, not the cabin burning. Thank God, but the barn, or what was left of it. The east wall gone, and the roof partially collapsed inward, and the smoke still rolling in the late afternoon air. His 4 horses were in the paddock. He counted them immediately automatically. All 4. Someone had opened the stalls before the fire caught, or the fire had been set when the barn was empty. He dismounted before the gray fully stopped and was moving toward the paddock, assessing chickens, scattered and frantic, but present the cabin door standing open, and on the porch step, sitting with a rifle across his knees, was old Pete Harker, who ran the mining claim 2 miles east, and who Ethan had spoken to maybe a dozen times in 6 years. Pete was 70 years old and moved like a man who had survived everything the mountain had thrown at him through stubbornness rather than speed. He looked up as Ethan came across the yard. She's all right, Pete said immediately, which made Ethan realize how fast he'd been moving. The cabin's all right. I kept them off it. Ethan stopped. How many? He said. 4 came up around midday, Pete said. Torched the barn first thing, didn't even announce themselves. I fired twice over their heads and they pulled back, but they circled around, and one of them put a torch to the corner before I could get a bead on him in the tree line. He shifted the rifle. They left after an hour. I expect they'll be back with more. Clara had ridden into the yard behind Ethan and was already down from the horse, taking in the barn, the paddock, the cabin. Pete. You were here, she said to Pete. Saw the smoke starting when I was working my claim, Pete said. Came to see what was what. He looked at Ethan. I know it wasn't lightning. No, Ethan said. It wasn't. Moss, Pete said. Moss, Ethan confirmed. Pete nodded slowly, like a man receiving information he'd been expecting. He burned the Carey place last winter, Pete said. Before Thomas Carey finally signed. Didn't know if you were aware. Ethan turned to look at Clara. She was looking at Pete. Thomas Carey, she said. Of Widow Creek. That's the one, Pete said. He gave me a statement, Clara said quietly. He didn't mention the fire. He wouldn't, Pete said. Thomas signed after the fire. He's been ashamed of it ever since. The old man looked at the ruined barn. Some men have a breaking point. Everyone has a breaking point, Clara said. The question is what you do when you reach it. Pete looked at her with the particular attention of a man reassessing what he's dealing with. You're the Bennett girl, he said. I am. Heard you went to Helena. Word travels fast, Ethan said. Word travels fast when men on horseback are riding up and down the mountain asking questions, Pete said dryly. Doyle's been to 3 claims in the last 2 days, asking where you'd gone. He paused. Might be the reason 2 of your other neighbors showed up this afternoon. He tilted his head toward the tree line behind the cabin. Ethan turned. Coming through the pines were two more figures. A heavy-set man Ethan recognized as Frank Odom, who ran cattle on the east slope, and beside him, a woman in her 50s, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked land all her life. May Sutton, whose husband had died 3 years ago, and who had since run her homestead alone, which was something most people in the county hadn't thought she could do, and which she'd been doing without any particular concern for what most people thought. They came into the yard and stopped and looked at the barn. "Moss's men," Frank said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ethan said. "Same as Carrie," May said. She looked at Clara. "Same as what he tried on the Kowalski place last summer. They don't sign something burns. They sign Moss gets the land." She tilted her head. "You went to Helena." "Yes," Clara said. "And federal investigation is open," Clara said. "Forgery charge, usury, potential land fraud across multiple properties." She paused. "If the other families are willing to speak—" "We're willing," May said immediately, not looking at Frank, not consulting anyone, just saying it the way a person says a thing they've been waiting to say for a long time. Frank Odom looked at May. Then he looked at the ruined barn. Then he looked at Clara. "My deed," he said slowly. "Moss has been pushing me to refinance my grazing rights through his office. I haven't signed yet. He said I'd regret it." He stopped. "I thought he meant financial regret." "He meant this kind," Pete said, nodding at the barn. Frank was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need from us?" he said. They sat in the cabin that night, all 5 of them, Ethan and Clara and Pete and Frank and May, around the table and the floor with the window dark and the fire going and the documents spread across the table again. Clara talked and they listened, and Ethan watched the room. He watched Pete Harker, who had come 2 miles on an old man's legs with a rifle and kept 4 of Moss's men off the cabin because some things were simple for some people. He watched Frank Odom's face move from fear through calculation, through something that landed finally on resolution. The specific expression of a man who has found the floor he's willing to stand on. He watched May Sutton, who wasn't afraid at all, who looked at the documents with the focus of someone looking at a map and understanding for the first time where they are. And he watched Clara. She had ridden 5 days and made a federal case out of 4 months of secret work and come home to a burning barn, and she was sitting at his kitchen table explaining land law to 4 people who needed to understand it, and her voice was clear and her back was straight, and she did not look. Ethan thought like a girl who needed saving. She looked like a girl who was doing the saving. Something in his chest pulled tight around that, and he identified it, and he didn't push it away the way he would have a year ago, because he'd been pushing things away on this mountain for 10 years, and all he had to show for it was an empty cabin and a very good relationship with solitude. "We need to get to the federal examiner before Moss can interfere with the investigation," Clara was saying. "Greer has the copies, but if Moss has friends in Helena—" "He has the county judge," Pete said. "Not sure about federal level." "There's someone above Greer," Clara said. "A regional commissioner in Butte. If Moss applies pressure to Greer, there's an escalation path. But I need more statements, more cases. The more names attached to this, the harder it is to make it disappear." "I'll sign," May said. "I'll sign," Pete said. Frank was quiet. "Frank," May said. "I'm thinking," he said. "Think faster," May said. "Because if Moss comes up here again, and the answer's still just the 3 of us, those men come back with more riders, and next time, it's not just a barn." Frank looked at Clara. "You're 17, he said. Not unkindly, more with a kind of wonder. "Yes," she said. "And you built all of this." "My mother taught school for 12 years, Clara said. "She believed the law could be used to protect people if they were willing to learn it. I spent my life in her library." She paused. "She died broke and worn out, so I have complicated feelings about her optimism. But she wasn't wrong about the law." Frank Odom was quiet for another moment. Then he reached across the table and pulled the blank statement form toward him. "Where do I sign?" he said. They left Frank and May and Pete just after midnight, and when the cabin door closed, and it was just the two of them in the quiet. Ethan built the fire back up, and Clara sat at the table, and finally, for the first time since they'd seen the smoke on the ridge, she put her face in her hands. Not crying, just stopping. Letting the machinery rest for a moment. Ethan put a cup of coffee in front of her, and sat across the table, and didn't say anything. After a while, she lifted her head. "The barn," she said. "I can rebuild it," he said. "It's my fault." "It's Moss's fault," Ethan said. "Don't carry his choices for him." She looked at the table. "He's going to come here again," she said. "With more men. The investigation buys time, but it doesn't stop him, not immediately. Not before he decides to make things worse." "I know," Ethan said. "And you're still here," she said. He looked at her. "Did you think I wouldn't be?" "I thought." She stopped, tried again. "You could have taken me to Helena and come back and told yourself you'd done the decent thing. The barn is gone. Moss's men know where you live. Staying in this means it gets worse before it gets better, and there's no guarantee of better." "There's rarely a guarantee of better," Ethan said. "Didn't stop being worth doing." She looked at him for a long time. The firelight between them. The mountain quiet outside. "Your brother," she said softly. "Is that what this is?" It wasn't quite right, but it wasn't quite a wrong either. "Maybe some of it," he said honestly. "But not the part that matters most." "What matters most?" He looked at her across the table. This girl with 4 months of carefully built evidence, and a burned barn, and 4 new allies, and a federal case number and eyes that had never once in his presence asked him for something she hadn't also been willing to fight for herself. "You matter most," he said. The words landed between them. Clara looked at him, and for just a moment, the careful, composed surface of her, the armor she'd been wearing since the alley in Harlow Creek, since before that, probably since the world had started telling her she wasn't worth much, and she'd started having to argue with it, shifted. Not gone, not down, but permeable briefly, the way walls get when the person behind them is surprised by something real. "Ethan," she said, and then stopped because she didn't have the rest of the sentence yet, or she had it and wasn't ready to say it, and that was all right. Some things moved slower than crises. Some things deserved to. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I just—" She looked at her hands. "I've been doing everything alone for so long that I've forgotten what it's like when someone means it." "I mean it," he said. She nodded. She believed him. He could see it, the believing. It sat differently on her face than the assessing had, softer at the edges, more still. "Get some sleep," Ethan said quietly. "Tomorrow is going to ask for more from both of us." She stood from the table and picked up her bag, the documents still safe inside, because Clara Bennett never stopped being Clara Bennett, not even at midnight, not even exhausted, and she paused at the foot of the loft ladder. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the barn, or the ride, or any of the specific things. Just for being the kind of man you are." He didn't answer right away, because he wasn't sure he'd been that man for very long, and he wanted to be honest about that. But she was already climbing the ladder, and maybe some answers didn't need to be given immediately, and maybe that was also all right. Outside, the mountain held its ground in the dark, and somewhere down the South Trail, Gerald Moss was learning that a federal investigation had been opened in his name, and that 4 of his county neighbors had signed statements, and that the girl he'd sent men to collect had walked into a federal building and laid 4 months of meticulous work on a supervisor's desk and walked out with a case number. And Ethan Walker sat at his kitchen table and listened to the fire and understood that the calm before the next storm was going to be short. He had never been more certain of anything in his life, and he had never in all the years he'd spent alone on this mountain been less sorry about what was coming. Gerald Moss arrived at the ranch 3 days after the barn burned. Not with Doyle, not with 2 or 3 riders. He came with 7 men, a county sheriff's deputy, and a piece of paper that he held in front of him like a weapon, which was exactly what it was. Ethan heard them on the trail before they cleared the tree line. He'd been hearing things on that trail for 3 days, every shift of wind, every horse on the lower slope, and he'd told Clara 2 days ago that Moss would come himself this time, because men like Moss only sent intermediaries until the intermediaries stopped working. Then they came personally because they believed the force of their own presence could accomplish what hired men could not. "He's here," Clara said from the window. "I know." Ethan stepped onto the porch. He'd left his rifle inside, deliberately. A rifle on the porch told men what you were afraid of. He wasn't afraid, and he wanted Moss to understand that before anyone said a word. The group pulled up in the yard. Moss was in the center, well-dressed, even on horseback, white-haired, the patient expression of a man accustomed to outcomes going his way. The deputy was young, uncomfortable, his eyes moving to the ruined barn and back. "Walker," Moss said. "Moss," Ethan said. "I've come to resolve this matter personally." Moss held up the paper. "This is a county order, requiring the surrender of any documents, correspondence or records pertaining to the estate of William Bennett, currently in unlawful possession of his minor daughter, Clara Bennett. The order also directs Miss Bennett to appear before Judge Harlan on Friday for a competency hearing regarding her legal standing to file complaints on behalf of the estate." Ethan looked at the paper. He didn't reach for it. "A competency hearing," he said. "She's 17, Moss said. She has no legal standing to make federal complaints, enter into agreements with government offices, or speak on behalf of her father's estate. She needs a legal guardian. The court has appointed one." "Who?" Ethan said. Moss smiled, not warmly. "Myself," he said. "Given my existing financial relationship with the estate, the court felt it was appropriate." The yard went very quiet. Ethan heard Clara behind him, not moving, not speaking, just there. He could feel her understanding what she'd just heard in real time. Moss hadn't come to take the documents. He'd come to make her legally invisible. If the court declared her a ward under Moss's guardianship, every complaint she'd filed in, Helena evaporated. Every statement she'd collected became inadmissible. Every piece of evidence she'd spent 4 months building became property of the man she'd built it against. It was elegant in the particular ugly way that legal machinery could be elegant when someone had spent 30 years learning how to use it as a weapon. "That order," Ethan said carefully, "was signed by Judge Harlan." "It was," Moss said. "Judge Harlan, whose re-election campaign you funded entirely last November." Something moved across Moss's face. "That's a public record, Walker. Nothing improper about supporting a candidate." "No," Ethan agreed. "Just context." He looked at the deputy. "Son, do you know what's in that order?" The deputy shifted in his saddle. He was maybe 22, with the look of someone who had taken a job for steady wages and was only now beginning to understand what the wages were actually buying. "It's a lawful court order," the deputy said. But he said it to his saddle horn, not to Ethan. "It is," Ethan said. "It's also a document produced by a judge owned by the man who burned my barn last Tuesday." He let that land. "You were there for that part too, deputy, or did you come in after?" "I don't know anything about any barn," the deputy said. "No," Ethan said. "I don't imagine Doyle filed a report." Moss cut in. "This conversation is not productive. Miss Bennett, come out here, please. This doesn't need to be difficult." Silence from inside the cabin. "Clara," Moss said, and his voice had changed, not louder, but harder, underneath the patience thinning to reveal what was below it. "I am trying to help you. You are a minor child with no family, no money, and no legal standing who has spent 3 weeks making accusations against a respected member of this community. I am offering you a resolution. Come out, and we'll discuss it reasonably." The cabin door opened. Clara stepped onto the porch beside Ethan. She was holding her travel bag. She looked at Gerald Moss with the same dark, steady eyes she'd used in the alley in Harlow Creek 3 weeks ago, and her face had the same quality it had, then not fearless because she wasn't performing fearlessness, but past fear, which is a different thing and more durable. "Mr. Moss," she said, "I'd like to ask you a question." Moss looked at her with the expression of a man managing mild impatience. "Ask," he said. "The deed to my father's land, the one bearing his forged signature, when did you first know it was forged?" The yard went still. One of Moss's 7 men shifted his horse. The deputy looked up. Moss's expression didn't change. That was telling, Ethan thought. A man genuinely surprised by an accusation reacts. A man who has been anticipating it manages. That's a serious allegation, Moss said. Yes, Clara said. I know. I made it to a federal examiner in Helena 11 days ago, and he agreed. The signature does not match 6 authenticated samples from the same period. The letter formation is structurally inconsistent with my father's documented hand. She paused. A federal investigation is currently open. Case number 184 MT047. You're welcome to verify that. Moss was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Whatever that office believes they have, he said, is based on the word of a minor child with no legal standing who is currently under my court-ordered guardianship. The federal case will be informed of the competency ruling. It will be suspended pending review. He said it with the certainty of a man who has already made the calls, who has already put the machinery in motion. This is over, Clara. I'm trying to give you a dignified exit. I'm not looking for a dignified exit, Clara said. I'm looking for justice for my father. Your father, Moss said, and something in his voice shifted, something uglier showing through the thing underneath the patience. Was a poor manager who borrowed money he couldn't repay and signed agreements he didn't fully understand. That is not my fault. That is not anyone's fault but his. Clara's jaw tightened. My father, she said, signed nothing regarding that property. I have proved that, and you know it. Enough, Moss said. He looked at his men. Take her bag. 2 men dismounted. Ethan stepped forward. Not a large movement, not dramatic. Just one step, putting himself between Clara and the 2 men, and the quality of that single step. The absolute stillness at the end of it, the complete absence of urgency or anxiety, stopped the 2 men before they'd gone 3 paces. Because men who have done violence understand the language of someone who is not afraid of it. And Ethan Walker had spent 6 years on a mountain in the particular solitude of a man who had nothing left to lose, and it showed, and the 2 men felt it, and they stopped. Walker, Moss said very quietly. Don't. The lady's bag is hers, Ethan said. That bag contains documents belonging to the Bennett estate, of which I am now the court-appointed guardian. I have legal authority. You have a piece of paper signed by a judge you bought, Ethan said. That's different from legal authority. It will hold up in court. Maybe in your county court, Ethan said. Let's see how it holds up in federal. And that was when Pete Harker came through the tree line on the north side of the yard, with Frank Odom behind him, and May Sutton, and Thomas Carey, who had signed Moss's documents under duress and burned with shame ever since. And behind them, 4 more people that Ethan half recognized from the valley below. Farmers, settlers, people who had learned to be quiet and had apparently decided this morning to stop. 11 people in total coming into the yard from the tree line with the deliberate, unhurried movement of people who had talked about this and made up their minds. Moss turned in his saddle and saw them, and for the first time since he'd ridden into the yard, something crossed his face that wasn't controlled. What is this? He said. These are your neighbors, Clara said from the porch. The ones you've been patient with. May Sutton walked to the front of the group and stopped. She looked at the deputy. Deputy Cole, she said. My name is May Sutton. I have a homestead on the east slope. 3 years ago, Mr. Moss offered to buy my land at a price I didn't accept. 2 months later, my well was poisoned. A dead coyote dropped in during the night. She said it plainly, with no particular emotion, the way people describe things that happened a long time ago and have been carrying since. I signed an agreement with him the following week because I had no water and no other options. I'd like to add that to any official record you're keeping today. Deputy Cole stared at her. Thomas Carey stepped forward. He was a big man, broad, with the kind of face that showed everything, and right now what it showed was shame and determination, fighting each other to a draw. Moss burned my barn, he said. Same as Walker's. I signed after that because I had 4 children, and I couldn't. He stopped. His throat moved. I signed because I was afraid. And I've been afraid ever since, and I'm done with it. The deputy had stopped looking at his saddle horn. He was looking at Thomas Carey, and then at May Sutton, and then at the ruined barn behind Ethan's cabin, and something was moving across his young face, the particular expression of a person whose understanding of a situation is being forcibly revised in real time. "Mr. Moss," the deputy said slowly. "Don't," Moss said. One word directed at the deputy like a blade. The deputy flinched. Then he squared his shoulders. "Mr. Moss, I need to ask you directly. Did you authorize the burning of any property on this mountain?" "That is an absurd question." "Did you?" the deputy said. The yard held its breath. Moss looked at the deputy with the particular contempt of a man who has made someone and is now watching them forget it. "You work for the county," Moss said. "The county funds come through the commissioner's office. The commissioner—" "I know who the commissioner is," the deputy said. "I'm asking about the barn." Silence. Doyle, who had been sitting his horse at the back of Moss's group without speaking, moved his horse slightly to the left. A small adjustment. But Ethan saw it, and it told him that Doyle was also doing a calculation, and the calculation was coming out differently than it had when they'd ridden up the mountain that morning. "Doyle," Ethan said quietly. The big man looked at him. "Those 4 horses in the paddock," Ethan said. "My barn burned while I was gone. Someone opened the stall gates first so the horses could get out." He paused. "That was you, wasn't it?" Doyle's face was a wall, but something behind the wall shifted. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Yes, you do," Ethan said. "You came up here and you opened the gates, and then you let them set the fire because you'll do what Moss pays you to do, but you're not going to let horses burn." He kept his voice level, almost gentle. "There's still a line somewhere in you, Doyle. I can see it." Moss turned on Ethan. "Enough," he said, and the patience was gone. Now completely gone. And what was underneath it was cold and hard and very old. "You want to fight Walker? Fine. We'll have a fight. I'll tie this property up in county court for 5 years. I'll have your grazing rights reviewed. I'll make sure every supplier in Harlow Creek understands that doing business with you creates complications. By the time I'm finished—" "By the time you're finished," said a new voice from the trail, "you'll be explaining all of this to a federal marshal." Everyone turned. Coming up the South Trail on a road-dusted horse was a man in his 40s with a federal marshal's badge on his coat, and behind him, 2 more riders with the same. Arthur Greer had sent them. Ethan hadn't known. Clara hadn't known. But Greer, it turned out, was the kind of bureaucrat who believed in process enough to act on it. And the process, once he'd reviewed Calloway's forgery findings and received 4 signed statements from Valley settlers, had been to telegraph the federal marshal's office in Butte. The lead marshal rode into the yard and took in the scene with the practiced efficiency of a man who had ridden into complicated yards before. "Gerald Moss," he said. Moss sat very still on his horse. "I'm Marshal Davies," the man said. "I have a federal warrant for your attendance at a hearing in Helena regarding allegations of fraud, forgery, and property theft under federal land statutes. You're not under arrest at this time, but you will accompany us to Helena today." The 2 riders behind Davies fanned out slightly, taking in the yard Moss's men, the deputy. Moss looked at the warrant. Then he looked at Clara. She was standing on the porch with her travel bag and her straight spine and her level eyes, and she looked back at him without triumph, just steadily, the way she'd been looking at things since the beginning, like she was seeing them clearly and had decided what she was going to do about it. "You knew they were coming," Moss said to her. "I knew Greer was the kind of man who would act on evidence," she said. "I didn't know when." She paused. "I'm glad it was today." Moss looked at her for a long moment. In his face, Ethan could see the machinery of 30 years, the patience, the calculation, the absolute certainty that resources and time could solve any problem running up against something it hadn't been built to handle. A girl with nothing but her mother's library, and 4 months, and the conviction that the law could still mean something. "You'll regret this," Moss said quietly. Not threatening exactly, more like a man who hasn't yet accepted that a thing is real. "Mr. Moss," Marshal Davies said, "your horse, please." It took 2 more hours for the yard to clear. The deputy Cole, whose first name turned out to be James, stayed behind after the marshals left with Moss. He sat on his horse in the yard with the particular expression of a young man trying to figure out what he'd been a part of and what to do now. I didn't know about the barn, he said to Ethan. I want you to know that. I believe you, Ethan said. I knew Moss had I knew there were things I didn't ask about, Cole said. That's different from not knowing, and I understand that. It is different, Ethan agreed. What are you going to do with the understanding? Cole was quiet. I expect there's a report I need to write, he said finally. A proper one. He glanced at May Sutton, who was talking to Clara near the paddock fence. I expect there are several. I expect so too, Ethan said. Cole rode out. Pete Harker and Frank Odom spent another half hour stacking what could be salvaged from the barn wall before Pete declared his knees had contributed all they intended to contribute for one day, and the two of them left with the easy familiarity of men who had done a thing together and would remember it. May Sutton hugged Clara before she left. Not a performative hug, a real one. One arm around her shoulders, brief and firm, the kind of contact offered by someone who understands what a person has been carrying. Thomas Carey shook Clara's hand. I'm sorry I signed, he said. I should have. You had 4 children, Clara said. You were protecting them. That's not something to apologize for. I'm apologizing anyway, he said. And I'm glad you didn't stop. I almost did, she said quietly. More than once. Carey nodded. He looked at Ethan. Take care of her, he said, then caught himself glancing at Clara's expression. Or that is I meant. He knows what you meant, Clara said. Thank you, Thomas. When everyone was gone, the yard held the particular stillness that comes after a great deal of noise. Ethan sat on the porch step. Clara sat beside him, not across from him, beside him closer than she'd positioned herself in all the weeks before, and he was aware of it without making it into anything it didn't need to be yet. It's not over, she said. No, he agreed. The hearing in Helena. Whatever Moss's lawyers do, the county court situation. He has resources. He'll fight this for a long time. He will, Ethan said. But he's fighting it on federal ground now instead of county ground, and that's different. And he's doing it with 11 names attached to a federal complaint instead of 1. He paused. That's different too. Clara was quiet for a moment. Greer sent the marshals, she said. He didn't have to do that. He could have processed the papers and sat on them for months. He did what was right, Ethan said. People don't always do what's right, Clara said. It's worth noticing when they do. He looked at her profile in the late afternoon light, the set of her jaw, the dark hair falling loose from the braid. She'd put it in that morning, the hands clasped in her lap that had spent 3 weeks carrying documents sewn into a bag lining. What do you want to do? He said. After all of this, when it's resolved. She turned to look at him. What do you mean? I mean you've been running toward something for 3 weeks, he said. Helena the case Moss. What do you want when there's not something to run toward? She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. I want my father's land back, she said. Or justice for it if it can't be recovered. I want Ruth Pollard and May Sutton and Thomas Carey to get back what they lost or fair payment for it. She paused. I want to finish what I started. And after that, he said. The question hung between them. I don't know, she said honestly. I haven't let myself think past the immediate thing in so long that I'm not sure I know how. She looked at her hands. I don't have a home anymore. My father's land is tied up in a federal case. I have $4 and a travel bag with legal documents in the lining. You have the North Ridge, Ethan said. She looked at him. I didn't elaborate because she was a woman who understood what people meant when they said things, and elaborating would have been explaining, and she didn't need him to explain. Ethan, she said. That's my name, he said. I need you to know something. She turned to face him more fully with the same directness she brought to everything. No hedging, no performance. Just Clara being honest, because it was the only way she knew how to be. I'm not staying because I need somewhere to go. I'm staying because I want to be here. She paused. If that's something you want too. He looked at her. Clara, he said. I stepped in front of Gerald Moss and 7 armed men for you this morning. I know, she said. I think I covered that question, he said. Something crossed her face, not the armor dropping, but something moving within it. Warmth, finding a way through the carefully maintained architecture of a person who'd taught herself not to hope too hard for things. "You covered the action," she said. "I wanted the words." He was quiet for a moment. "You make me want to be less afraid of things," he said. "I've been afraid of caring about something and losing it for 10 years. You walked into that alley in Harlow Creek, and you said I am not property, and something in me understood that I had been treating myself like property too. Like something to be managed and protected from its own feelings." He looked at her. "I want you here. Not because you need it. Because I do." The silence after that was the good kind. Clara reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, not grasping, just resting there. The simple warm weight of contact between two people who have been through something together and come out the other side changed. "The barn needs rebuilding," she said after a moment. "It does," he said. "Pete'll help, I expect. Frank too." "Probably." "And the chickens got into the garden," she said. "I noticed." "That's going to need attention in the morning." "Yes," he said. "So." She kept her hand where it was. "We have things to do." "We do," he said. The mountain held them in the last of the day's light, and the valley below went gold, and then amber, and then the particular quiet blue of early evening, and two people sat on a porch step in the Montana Territory summer, and let the day be finished, and the next one be not yet arrived, and between those two things there was a space that felt for the first time in a long time like enough. The letter from Helena arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the marshals rode Gerald Moss down the South Trail. Pete Harker brought it up from town, because Pete Harker had quietly appointed himself the ranch's connection to the outside world, a role no one had offered him, and he had simply assumed with the particular authority of a 70-year-old man who had decided he was involved in something and intended to stay that way. He rode up mid-morning, tied his horse at the post, and handed the envelope to Clara without ceremony. "Federal seal," he said. "Figured it shouldn't wait." Clara looked at the envelope for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked to the porch step and sat down and opened it. Ethan came around the side of the cabin from where he'd been working on the new barn frame and read her face before he read anything else. She was holding the letter with both hands, and her expression was doing several things at once. The particular complicated movement of a face receiving news. It has wanted for a long time and is not yet sure it's allowed to believe. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "The investigation is complete," she said. "Gerald Moss has been formally charged under federal land statutes, fraud, forgery, and unlawful debt collection." She looked back at the letter. "The property deed for my father's land has been voided. The land reverts to the estate." Her voice stayed level, but something in it was different, thinner, like a wire pulled to its limit. "All debt contracts associated with the fraudulent loan are declared void. The affected parties—" She stopped. "Read it," Ethan said quietly. "The affected parties, including May Sutton, Thomas Carey, Ruth Pollard, Frank Odom, and 7 additional named settlers, are entitled to petition for restoration of transferred property or financial compensation through the federal restitution process." She folded the letter carefully along its original creases. "It's done," she said. Pete Harker took his hat off and held it against his chest. That was all he did. It was enough. Ethan sat beside Clara on the step. She was not crying. He hadn't expected her to be. But she was very still in the way that people are still when the thing they have been moving toward for a long time has stopped moving and they suddenly have to reckon with the stillness. "Your mother's library," Ethan said. Clara made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that had nothing to do with laughing. "She would have been insufferable about this," Clara said. "She would have said she told me so about the law for the rest of her natural life." She pressed the letter briefly against her chest, flat-palmed, like checking that it was real. "She also would have said, I should thank the people who helped me." "You can do that," Ethan said. "I intend to," she said. She looked at Pete. "Starting with you." Pete waved a hand. "Old men need something to do," he said. "You gave me something to do. We're even." The news moved through the valley faster than Ethan would have thought possible for a community that communicated primarily on horseback. By the following morning, May Sutton had sent word that she was coming up Saturday. Thomas Carey sent a note through Pete saying he'd like to bring his family if that was all right. Frank Odom showed up in person on Friday afternoon without any advance warning, which was consistent with everything Ethan knew about Frank, and stood in the yard turning his hat in his hands. "The restitution process," Frank said. "For the grazing rights. You think it's real? You think they'll actually pay?" "I think the federal government moves slow," Clara said. "But I think they move." Frank nodded. He kept turning his hat. "I want to say something," he said. "And I'm not good at saying things, so I'm going to say it badly, and I hope you'll take the meaning rather than the exact words." "Go ahead," Clara said. "When you came up that mountain," Frank said, "you were a girl with a bag and a problem, and most of us figured, well, we figured you'd be gone before long, one way or another." He stopped. "I'm glad you weren't gone, and I'm glad Walker here had the sense to well." He looked at Ethan. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," Ethan said. Frank put his hat back on. "Saturday," he said. "I'll bring Margaret's cornbread." He mounted his horse and rode out, and that was the entirety of Frank Odom's speech, and it was, Ethan thought, one of the finest he'd ever heard. Saturday arrived with a clarity that the Montana summer occasionally produced between its punishing heat and its sudden mountain storms. A morning so clean and still that every sound carried, and the air felt like something you could hold. By mid-morning, there were 11 people in the yard and on the porch, and spilling into the space around it. May Sutton brought her eldest daughter, a woman of 30, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of cutting straight to what mattered. Thomas Carey brought all 4 children, who immediately found the chicken run and stationed themselves there for the remainder of the morning, with the devoted attention of children who have found chickens. Ruth Pollard, who Ethan was meeting for the first time, despite having heard her name for weeks, was a small woman in her 60s, with the quiet authority of someone who has survived a great deal and chosen deliberately not to be diminished by it. She took Clara's hand when she arrived and held it for a moment. "I didn't think anyone was going to help us," Ruth said. "I want you to know that. I had stopped thinking it." "Someone helped me first," Clara said. She looked at Ethan across the yard. "I think that's how it works." Ruth followed her eyes. "Is it settled between you two?" she asked with the forthright curiosity of a woman who had earned the right to ask direct questions. Clara looked back at Ruth. "It's settling," she said. Ruth nodded as though that were exactly the right answer. The afternoon moved at the pace of people who have shared something difficult and have arrived together at the other side of it. Food appeared from various bags and saddlebags. Pete Harker held court near the woodpile, telling a story about a mining claim dispute in 1871 that may or may not have been relevant to the present situation, but that everyone listened to anyway because Pete told it well. Ethan moved through the gathering, doing what he always did in groups, staying at the edges, watching, making sure there was enough of everything without making a production of it. He'd spent 6 years in solitude, and a yard full of people was not his natural element, but he found that this particular yard full of people didn't require him to be something he wasn't, and that was different from every other crowd he could remember. Clara found him near the paddock in the mid-afternoon, standing with his arms on the top rail watching the horses. "You're hiding," she said. "I'm watching the horses," he said. "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive." He smiled. She leaned on the rail beside him. "Ruth asked me if we were settled," she said. "I heard." "You have good ears." "Mountain habit," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "What did you hear me say?" she asked. "That it's settling," he said. She nodded, looking at the horses. "Is that all right?" she said. "That I said settling instead of settled?" He thought about it. "Settling is honest," he said. "Settled implies something stopped moving. I don't think this—" He gestured vaguely, meaning both of them and the space between them and everything that had happened to get here has stopped moving. "No," she agreed. "It hasn't." He looked at her profile. She was watching the horses with the same attention she gave everything, the same quality of being fully present in the thing she was doing. "I've been thinking about your father's land," he said. She turned. "What about it?" "It reverts to the estate," he said. "Which means it's yours. 42 acres in the Yellowstone Valley. Good land, you said." "Good land," she confirmed carefully. "You could go back," he said. "Start over there. It's what your father built." She was quiet for a long moment, reading him. "Is that what you want?" she said. "I want what's right for you," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not what I want." "Then say that," she said. Simply, directly. Clara Bennett in the absolute essence of herself. "I don't want you to go to the Yellowstone Valley," he said. "I want you to stay on this mountain. I want to rebuild that barn, and fix the east fence line, and plant a proper garden next spring, and argue about the chickens with you until I'm too old to argue about anything." He paused. "I want to marry you if you'll have me. When you're ready. Which doesn't have to be now." She looked at him. He looked back. "You're asking me," she said, "while we're standing at a paddock fence with 11 people 40 feet behind us." "The moment presented itself," he said. Her mouth curved. "I'll have you," she said. "When I'm ready." She turned back to the horses. "Which might not be as far off as you think." He turned back to the horses, too. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the rail, and behind them the gathering moved and talked and laughed, and the mountain summer held everything in its particular gold light, and Ethan Walker understood with the specific and unfamiliar quality of a man receiving something he had stopped believing was available to him, that this was what it felt like when a life changed direction. Not in the dramatic moment, not in the alley or the federal office or the yard with 7 armed men, but here quietly at a paddock fence with a girl who said, "I'll have you the same way." She said everything directly without ornamentation, meaning exactly what she said. 3 weeks later, the trouble came back. Not Moss was in Helena facing federal proceedings that his lawyers were making very expensive and very slow, but that they were not winning. The trouble came in a different shape. It came in the form of a man named Aldrich. Ethan heard the name from Pete Harker, who heard it from the Harlow Creek postmaster, who heard it from a freighter passing through from the south. Henry Aldrich, the same. Henry Aldrich, who had run the same scheme in Crow Creek a decade earlier. The same man whose patience and resources had buried Ethan's brother, had purchased Moss's remaining county contracts at a steep discount while Moss was occupied with federal proceedings, which meant he now had a financial interest in 12 land arrangements in the valley, which meant he was coming. Pete told Ethan on a Wednesday morning, and Ethan stood in the yard and received the information with a stillness that Pete recognized as something other than calm. "You know him," Pete said. "I know him," Ethan said. "How bad?" Ethan looked at the rebuilt barn frame, 2 weeks of work, his and Frank's and Pete's, standing solid in the summer light. "Bad," he said. I went inside and told Clara. She was at the table with the restitution paperwork that the federal office had sent, working through the language with the focused attention she brought to documents. She listened to everything Ethan said without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her pen. "He bought the contracts," she said. "Yes. To do what Moss's scheme is exposed. The federal case is open. The same methods. Aldrich isn't Moss," Ethan said. "Moss was patient. Aldrich is..." He stopped finding the word. "Aldrich is efficient. He doesn't want the land for its own sake. He wants the leverage. He buys the debt, he calls it in, and if people can't pay, he takes what they have and moves on. He doesn't build a county empire. He strips it and leaves." Clara watched him. "And your brother," she said quietly. "Daniel wouldn't let it go," Ethan said. "And Aldrich?" He said it flat. No drama, just the fact of it. "Aldrich doesn't leave loose ends." "You think he'd come after you specifically?" "I think when he finds out what happened to Moss's operation, that a mountain cowboy and a 17-year-old girl pulled it apart from the inside, yes. I think he comes after us specifically." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she picked her pen back up. "How long do we have?" she said. "Pete thinks he's already in the county. Maybe a week before he makes contact. Then we have a week, she said. He stared at her. You're not... He stopped. Clara, we have the federal connection now, she said, not looking up from the page. We have Greer and Marshall Davies and a case number and 11 names. Aldrich is coming into a situation that is nothing like the one he's used to operating in. She dipped the pen. And he's coming after someone who burned his operation to the ground in Crow Creek once without even knowing she existed. She looked up. Write to Davies today. Tell him Aldrich's name and what he does and what connection he had to your brother. That goes into the federal file immediately. Clara. And then ride to Mays and Frank's and tell them. They deserve to know what's coming. She held his eyes. We don't hide from this, Ethan. We faced Moss. We face this. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid, he said. I'm terrified, she said. But we've established that those are different things. He sat down across from her at the table. You know what scared me most, he said. When Pete said Aldrich's name. What? That I'd lose you, he said. Not the ranch, not the land, you. She set the pen down. Then we make sure you don't, she said. That's what people do when they have something worth keeping. They fight for it. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, the same gesture from the porch step, that simple warm weight. Write to Davies. I'll draft the statement. He nodded. He picked up his pen. Marshall Davies' response came in 4 days. It arrived not as a letter, but as a rider, a deputy out of the Butte office, a woman in her 30s named Hargrove, who rode like she'd been born on a horse, and who handed the communication directly to Clara with the particular professional courtesy of someone treating her as the correspondent of record, which she was. The marshal wants you to know, Deputy Hargrove said, that Henry Aldrich is already known to the federal office. He's been operating in Wyoming and Idaho under different names. There's a pattern. She paused. There's also a warrant. It was issued last year, but Aldrich has been difficult to locate. He's in this county, Clara said. We know, Hargrove said. We've been behind him by about 10 days. Your letter helped us close that. She looked at Ethan. Marshall Davies asks that you not engage directly with Aldrich. If he makes contact, send word immediately. And if he doesn't wait for us to send word, Ethan said. Hargrove looked at him with the expression of a person who has thought about this and made peace with what it implies. Then you do what you need to do, she said, and send word after. She stayed the night, Clara insisted, and left the following morning before dawn riding south. They didn't have to wait long. Aldrich came on a Friday, and he came alone, which was either confidence or intelligence or both. He was smaller than Ethan remembered. Or maybe it was that Ethan was different from the 29-year-old who had last stood in the same space as this man. Aldrich was 50 now, thin with a face that had gone angular with age, and eyes that did their work before the rest of him committed to anything. He rode into the yard, and stopped and looked at the rebuilt barn frame and the cabin and the paddock, and then he looked at Ethan on the porch, and Clara standing in the doorway behind him, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Walker, he said finally. Aldrich, Ethan said. It's been a long time. Not long enough, Ethan said. Aldrich looked at him with something that might have been respect if it had any warmth in it. I heard what you did to Moss's operation, he said. Impressive, especially the girl. His eyes moved to Clara. She yours? I'm my own, Clara said from the doorway. Aldrich almost smiled. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said. Men who aren't here to cause trouble don't generally need to say so, Ethan said. Fair, Aldrich said. Then I'll be direct. I have purchased Moss's remaining contracts. Several of those contracts involve properties in this valley. I intend to collect on them. I'm informing you as a professional courtesy. You and I have history, and I'd prefer we handle this as two grown men rather than... He paused, looking at Clara again. Rather than however Moss handled it. You intend to collect on fraudulent debt, Clara said. Debt that a federal investigation has already identified as illegally structured. Aldrich looked at her with that almost smile again. The federal investigation concerns Moss's conduct, he said. I purchased the contracts in good faith from a third party. My conduct is separate. Your conduct, Clara said, is the purchase of instruments you knew to be fraudulent because you're the one who taught Moss the method. She stepped out of the doorway onto the porch. Daniel Walker, Crow Creek, 1874. The almost smile went away. For the first time since he'd ridden into the yard, something moved in Aldrich's face that wasn't controlled. That was an accident, he said. The federal file that was opened in your name last week doesn't use that word, Clara said. It uses several other words. You're welcome to read them. The silence in the yard was the kind that had weight. Aldrich looked at Clara, then at Ethan, then back at Clara. You're 17 years old, he said. Yes, she said. I am, and I have a federal case number, 4 months of documented evidence, 11 signed statements, and a deputy marshal who slept in our guest loft 4 days ago. She met his eyes without moving. You came to this valley because you thought you were buying into a situation that was already broken. You weren't. You bought into the end of it. Aldrich was quiet for a very long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Your brother, he said. And there was something in how he said it, not an apology. Aldrich didn't do apologies, but something that acknowledged the word meant something. An old man's recognition of a thing he'd done. Ethan looked back at him. Ride out, Ethan said, and don't come back to this valley. And if I don't, then the deputy marshal who slept in our guest loft comes back with the warrant that already has your name on it, Ethan said. And you spend your remaining professional years explaining Crow Creek to a federal judge. Another long silence. Aldrich gathered his reins. The girl, he said, not to Clara, to Ethan, which was a mistake. She has a name, Ethan said quietly. Aldrich looked at Clara. Miss Bennett, he said, you should know men like me don't disappear because one case gets made against us. I know, Clara said, but they get slower and smaller, and eventually the law catches up. She kept her eyes level. It already has. Aldrich rode out. They watched him go until the south trail took him around the bend and the sound of his horse faded into the mountain quiet. Then Clara put her hand on Ethan's arm, not gripping, just resting, and they stood there in the yard in the summer light until the last of the sound was gone. Do you believe he'll go? She said. No, Ethan said. But I believe Davies will find him, and I believe the warrant is real. He covered her hand with his. We did what we could do. We did, she said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment. Then she straightened and looked at the barn frame. The east wall needs another day's work, she said. It does, he said. Pete's coming tomorrow. He is. I'll make coffee enough for 3, she said. She went inside. Ethan stood in the yard a moment longer, looking at the mountain that had been his alone for 6 years. The trail, the pines, the rebuilt frame of a barn that had burned and was being made again. Everything the same, everything different. He went inside. The federal proceedings against Gerald Moss concluded in November. He was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of forgery, sentenced to 8 years, and stripped of his county landholdings, which were distributed through the federal restitution process to the families from whom they'd been taken. Thomas Carey got his farm back. Ruth Pollard received financial compensation equal to the assessed value of her lost property. Maisie Sutton's contested grazing rights were restored in full. Henry Aldrich was arrested in Wyoming in October on the existing federal warrant, with Clara Bennett's supplemental statement attached to the file. He did not go quietly, but he went. Deputy James Cole filed 7 reports over the fall and winter detailing irregularities in county court proceedings during Judge Harlan's tenure. Judge Harlan resigned in December. Cole was promoted the following spring, which surprised him considerably, and no one else at all. Arthur Greer sent Clara a personal note in January, saying that in his 22 years with the Federal Land Office, he had processed fewer than a handful of cases built with the quality of documentation and preparation that hers had demonstrated, and that he hoped she would consider a career in law when she reached the appropriate age. Clara read the letter twice, and then put it in the wooden box she kept on the shelf in the loft, the same shelf where she kept her mother's handwriting primer, and the deed to her father's land, which had been officially restored to the Bennett estate in September, and which she had signed over in October to May Sutton's Community Land Trust, because she had decided that what the land was worth wasn't the acreage. It was what it had made possible. Ethan rebuilt the barn through August and September with help from Pete and Frank and Thomas Carey's eldest son, a 17-year-old named Will, who turned out to have a natural aptitude for timber work and who came back 3 Saturdays in a row because Will Carey, it became apparent, was also a young man with a very serious interest in the opinion of a particular girl, approximately his own age. And that girl was May Sutton's daughter's daughter, who had started coming to the Ridge on Saturdays for reasons that everyone understood and no one mentioned directly. The mountain, it turned out, had a way of drawing people up. On the last Saturday of October, with the first cold coming down off the high peaks, and the year beginning its long turn toward dark, Clara and Ethan walked up to the North Ridge where the pines opened onto the overlook that faced south across the whole valley. He'd been up here 100 times alone. He'd shown it to her in September on a Sunday afternoon, and she'd stood at the edge of it and looked out across the valley for a long time without saying anything. And he'd understood that she was measuring something, not the view, but something larger. What she'd come through, what it had cost, what it had built. Today she stopped at the same spot and looked out again. "I've been thinking about what Greer said," she told him. "About the law career. About what it takes to make the law work for people who can't make it work for themselves." She leaned against a pine. "There are girls like me all over this territory. Women who don't know what their rights are because no one has told them. Families who signed things they didn't understand because they were afraid and alone." She turned to look at him. "I want to do something about that." He looked at her. "Define something," he said. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Maybe it starts here, teaching, explaining the law to people before someone like Moss can use it against them." She paused. "Your mother's library." "My mother didn't have a library," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant mine." The corner of her mouth moved. "I thought if there's space in the cabin, we could start small. People who need to understand a document before they sign it." He looked at her. "You want to start a school," he said. "I want to start something," she said. "Something that lasts longer than one case." He thought about it. He thought about Daniel, who had fought alone because the resources weren't there, because no one had shown him how to use the tools that existed, because the men who understood the law were all employed by the men who abused it. "There's space in the cabin," he said. She nodded. She looked back out at the valley. "This is a remarkable place," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I used to think remarkable places were somewhere else," she said. "Somewhere I hadn't gotten to yet, somewhere past whatever I was currently surviving." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't expect it to be here." "Neither did I," he said. She turned and looked at him, the full, direct, completely unguarded look that she'd been giving him more often lately, the one that she'd learned slowly to stop protecting herself against. "I'm ready," she said. He understood what she meant. "Now," he said. "Not this exact moment," she said. "But soon. When Pete's next in town and May can come up, I want the people who stood in that yard with us to be there." He reached out and brushed a pine needle from her hair. The simplest gesture, the most ordinary thing. The kind of thing that happens between two people when the space between them has become a place they both live. "I'll tell Pete," he said. She caught his hand as he lowered it and held it for a moment. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for stepping into that alley." He looked at her. "Thank you for not crying in it," he said. She laughed, the real one, the full one, unguarded and warm in the October air. He held on to her hand, and she let him, and the valley spread below them in the long autumn light, and the mountain held its ground the way it always had, patient and old and indifferent to the small human dramas played out on its slopes. Except that these particular humans on this particular slope had managed something the mountain hadn't seen in a while. They had taken a place that belonged to one lonely person and made it belong to two. And in the spring, when the community room was built off the east wall of the cabin, and May Sutton's daughter helped Clara carry in the first borrowed books, and Pete Harker showed up uninvited on the first teaching day and sat in the back row with his hat on his knee and listened to a young woman explain property law to 12 Valley settlers who had never heard it spoken plainly before. In that spring on that mountain, something that had been broken for a long time finished being mended. Not perfectly, not without scars, but mended. And Clara Bennett, who had been told she was property and had refused it, who had carried 4 months of evidence in the lining of a bag and walked into a federal office and said, "Here is what he did, and here is the proof." Clara Bennett stood in front of 12 people in a mountain cabin and taught them what her mother had spent a lifetime teaching her. That the law belonged to everyone. That knowing it was the first defense against those who would use it against you. That a person's worth was not decided by their circumstances. Ethan sat in the back beside Pete Harker and listened to his wife teach, and he thought about Daniel, and he thought about an alley in Harlow Creek, and he thought about what it meant to finally stop being afraid of the things worth keeping. He thought it meant this. It meant exactly this.